Welcome to the Human Frame podcast.
With me, Łucja Hawking.
Today I am joined with Chiara Fabbro, who is an Italian documentary photographer based in London whose work focuses on human rights and migration. Through her lens, she captures stories of resilience and displacement with deep respect and empathy for her subjects. Her projects have taken her from the refugee communities of Kuala Lumpur to migrant routes across the Balkans and the beaches of the Canary Islands. Chiara's work has been featured by The Times, CNN, Al Jazeera and El Salto, and she has collaborated with several NGOs on advocacy and fundraising campaigns, including Amnesty International, which I had the privilege of seeing. She is the winner of the 2021 Portrait of Humanity Award, received an honourable mention in the Photography for Humanity Global Prize, and she was shortlisted for the Marilyn Stafford Photo Reportage Award and the International Women's in Photo Association Award. Thank you again for joining me, Chiara. I'm really excited for this conversation, especially through a creative photography perspective. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, let's jump straight in. I kind of want to start straight with what drew you to photography and specifically documentary photography on migration and human rights. What's your journey with that?
So it started a bit by chance, I guess. I've always had a passion for photography, and that was on the side. And at some point I started getting involved with asylum seekers. Here in London specifically, I've been volunteering for quite a few years now with an organization supporting asylum seekers. And I started learning more about these topics through that experience, and then decided to do more work in that field, always at the beginning through volunteering experiences. But because I had some time of work, I traveled and did sort of experience different realities of both refugees and migrants during their journeys, and started learning more about the challenges and the realities people are faced with, especially due to sort of border policies and what that implies for their journeys. And it kept growing, and simultaneously I had the opportunity to use photography because a lot of the most organizations actually need photographic material, whether it is for fundraising or advocacy, for producing reports and all sorts of material. And it felt quite early on that would have been a somewhat more personal contribution rather than when you volunteer. Most often you do, all sorts of tasks, whatever is needed. It could be sort of literally moving boxes in a warehouse, or distributing hot meals, or whatever it is that it's needed. And that's, obviously it's amazing because it's very much needed. But at the same time, it felt like, it would have been a more personal contribution if I could do something that I felt was part of me. And so photography felt like a natural next step, and so I started doing more and more of that until it became a thing gradually.
Did it start when you were really young as well? Was it something that you were interested in?
No, that started. The passion for photography, yes, it's been with me for most of my life. But as I said, it was mostly as a hobby. No, this started after, as an adult, as a grown up, after my previous work was in science and research. So it's a completely different, it was a completely different environment, sector, let's say. So, yeah.
Does the way you kind of approach photography then come obviously a lot of research based, but do you think you use a lot of your past experiences of like scientific research, all that kind of stuff into how you do that, or?
Maybe not in the photography directly, but definitely, well, maybe also in the photography now that you mention it, in terms of sometimes more the sort of the technical aspect of, what makes a good photo, potentially in the sort of more clinical eye, if that makes sense. But I wouldn't say as much in the photography, because the photography comes more, spontaneous. I feel it comes from a different part of my brain. But definitely in the research work that goes into planning a project, I feel like sort of the more organized mindset of, or analytical mindset, or inquisitive, maybe I want to say, inquisitive mindset of sort of trying to find something out, both in research and when you're planning work on the field.
And then a lot of your work, obviously, I mean, what I've seen and from what I noticed was there's a lot of human connection, and I don't want to say journey, but there's something very emotive in your work that you do. You can see into their people's lives. And I was just wondering, how do you build trust with people when you do that? Because obviously to capture such a vulnerable moment and the situation, whether it's, a displaced person or a refugee, is obviously that takes a lot of trust. So yeah, I was just wondering how you do that.
Yes, it does. And it's a very delicate aspect of this work. So the way I normally work is I'm a person, I'm not a photographer. When I'm in a situation, I am there as a person first, which often directly translates to, the camera not even being out of the bag at the beginning. So it sort of initiate the interaction, just sort of human to human, and trying to sort of, get to know. Well, obviously, it depends on the situation. Sometimes there's more time and more opportunity to have conversations, and sometimes there is less of this, and it's a more superficial getting to know the person. But there's always some level of interaction that comes before the photography. And obviously, there needs to be some level of consent in a way or another, which, again, it depends on the situation. Sometimes it can be a sort of, there could be an actually having had a long conversation, having explained things very well, and what, who I am, why I'm there, why I'm asking to take photos, and what will happen to those photos. And sometimes it can be a very quick sort of, if it's someone in the distance, it can be a very quick sort of raise of the camera with an inquisitive eyes, like, is that okay? And then maybe the conversation happens afterwards. Are you okay? This photo might end up online in a way or another. Is that okay with you? But yes, obviously it's different type of shots. The most sort of intimate ones are the ones where there has been some level of relationship. And yes, it's often also relationship that are maintained afterwards. I'm in touch with a lot of the people that I photographed. So it's a true connection, I feel, in many cases.
Do you have a favorite interaction, favorite image that you took? I'm curious.
You know what? Sometimes I think the two don't overlap, like, unfortunately, in a way. But sometimes I feel like I have built very strong connections with people that maybe then I didn't necessarily take the strongest photos of. In terms of photographically speaking, they are strong to me because they tell a lot. But it's something you need to learn as a photographer, to sort of, when you then look at your photos, to try and understand which could be the strongest ones to convey a certain emotion or a certain message. It's actually quite hard to remove that personal connection, if you see what I mean. And yeah, I feel that. So for example, Shakila is a woman from Afghanistan I have built a very strong connection with. I met her in Bosnia during her journey with her family, trying to reach Europe, and we connected very strongly, and we're still in touch. And there's many aspects of Shakila's story and also the interaction we had after that are really sort of close to my heart. And there's a portrait I took of her that to me feels very, very strong. But I wouldn't say that necessarily, to a random photographer out there that is interested more in the photographic aspect, in the photographic strength of the photo. It's not necessarily the best photo I took, if that makes sense. But I hope that in terms of that connection, it comes across. I don't know if it's a photo that you've seen. If it was in the exhibition also?
Is it with
where we met?
The background with the curtains and she's standing on the side?
No, that's another very interesting story. No, so it's a lady who had her arm, I don't know what's the word in English, with a bandage, because she had her shoulder dislocated during a pushback by the police, by the way. And also, like, for example, another person that I felt a very deep connection with, I have no photos of her. I mean, I do have photos of her, and I have one that I think is very, very strong, but her daughter withdraw the consent from publishing the photos, even if she doesn't appear in the photo, but she doesn't want. So her mother wouldn't mind, but the daughter just didn't feel comfortable with photos of her family appearing, and therefore that I think it's also photographically strong, and it's also a very strong connection with the person herself. But yeah, it's just it's in my hard drive for me to look at privately.
But at least, like you said, at least you captured that, but it's something that you can look back on. When you choose a project, how do you balance telling a compelling visual story with the privacy, as you said, dignity and trauma of the people that you're taking pictures of?
Yeah, this is, again, a very delicate and challenging thing. As I said, I prioritize the relationship, and therefore it can take many attempts to sort of find the combination of connection and a story that is powerful to share. I do think all stories have that potential, but it also depends on technical basic things such as the level of language that I can share with the person I'm talking with, how much I'm able to learn about their story, very in practical terms. Some people have very good English. Unfortunately, I don't speak any of the languages that a lot of the people I've met speak. So we have to rely on sort of common foreign languages such as English most of the time. Sometimes it's been French. So it depends on their level of that language, or sometimes they can speak absolutely no English, but I can have, like, I'm thinking now of a young man from Syria with whom I've had very long and in-depth conversation because he was so easy and quick with Google Translate that it was seamless. But what I want to say is that the way you're able to interact with the person is an important piece of the puzzle, and how much you're able to learn about their story, and therefore, because I think all stories have the potential to be very powerful. But if I'm not able to learn that story, of course, that's sort of limiting how compelling a project can be, a story can be. So that's a sort of technical, practical aspect. But obviously, it's also the level of connection that you build, and with some people you connect with immediately, and with some others there's just not the same chemistry, like in everyday life. Really, it's as simple as that in a way. So you need to then balance that with that consent we talked about. And so you need to sort of, unfortunately, you need time to try and find the right balance of all these elements for being able to build something that respects all of this, basically. I don't know, does that make sense?
It does completely. It completely makes sense. And it just also got me thinking, like, how do you pick a project? Is there a specific process, or do you go where, unfortunately, like there is, when we hear in the news, and this is a mass area where refugees do unfortunately get, I don't know, put in camps or anything like that. Is that part of your process, or do you have another type?
So it depends, really. I think often it's when I feel something is a bit underreported, so there is maybe some need for drawing a bit of attention. That's how Bosnia started for me, for sure. I'm Italian, as I don't know if you said in your introduction, but people will have definitely guessed it by now. And I come from the region that neighbors the Balkans, so it's a border region with all that implies. A lot of people come into the country from the Balkans, so from the Balkan route, which goes through Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, through a border that is very near to my hometown. And in Italy, we hear a lot about the Mediterranean and the boat journeys across the Med, because obviously they are somewhat more, I don't want to say newsworthy, because newsworthy implies that's right for some reason, but I don't know, they get a lot more attention.
I guess it's because it's more localized, it's more impacted to the region, right?
Yes, definitely. Whereas the Balkan route doesn't get still a lot of attention. So that's what made me decide to sort of start focusing on it. Sort of both in that case, the proximity for, with my home region, and sort of feeling that it was something that somewhat I had some level of responsibility to learn more about myself, I guess, because that came after having had experiences abroad in other areas of the world and learning about different areas, and sort of then coming to realize that, wait a minute, I now know, I've been to Jordan, I've been to Malaysia, I know about the specific challenges of places far away, and how come I don't know, a lot about the place I come from and what is the situation there. And so, yeah, then combining that with the fact that it was a bit underreported, although then it was an unfortunate coincidence. There was a fire in Lipa, which is a big camp that they built in a border town in Bosnia-Herzegovina that sparked a lot of debate because of, how people were all of a sudden placed in this camp in the middle of nowhere, just sort of to not be seen, to not bother, basically. And it was a big part of the challenges of the situation there at the time. And, one of the reasons I felt that it was important to document the situation. And there was this big fire. As I was planning to go, there was this big fire. So all of a sudden, all the eyes were on it. So that I had to sort of pause and wait before I was actually able to go, because unfortunately, when there is a lot of media attention, it doesn't always come in the right way, if that makes sense. From what I could hear from people on the ground, working with the organization on the ground to support migrants, it was a lot of people coming from the media industry were maybe not necessarily familiar with this type of topics, and they were just sort of like, all of a sudden going there for like 2 days to make a news report, and maybe
they don't
not being
have the connection that you build, right? I guess it's also
exactly
because of time, maybe a lot of time.
Absolutely. But also, like, there's many delicate connection and relationship between the NGOs, the organization working on the ground, and the local communities, and that take time to build. If you are not aware of certain delicate interactions, you might sort of, I don't know if there's a phrase in English, but like put your foot on the wrong place at the wrong time kind of thing,
Yeah. And I just want to go specifically into one of your projects. So in your Invisible Border, a series, you explored identity, migration, and belonging. So what are some of the moments from that project that stuck with you the most, and why?
So Invisible Border, for the people listening, it's a project about Dimitri, who is a trans woman. Actually, I should say was, unfortunately, as she left us in not very nice circumstances. So Dimitri was born in a very small village on the island of Lesbos, which is a little island in the Aegean Sea that is very close to the border to Turkey. So it's a border island, let's say, because it's, I think, 8 kilometers of sea away from Turkey. And Dimitri was born there, and she very early on told her parents that she was a girl, but she faced very, very, very hard challenges throughout her life for being a trans woman, or a trans girl at the beginning, a trans woman. And she also moved away from her village, lived in Athens for some time, and then moved back to Lesbos to care for her elderly parents. But it's only when she eventually lost both of her parents that she started fully embracing her identity, in terms of also allowing herself to wear women clothes and high heels. And so if you see the photos, it's quite striking, because you can imagine this very, very small fisherman village with the sort of, the reality of a small fisherman village that we can probably all picture. And this very, I don't know if flamboyant is the right word, like sort of flamboyant lady wearing these sort of sparkling dresses and high heels walking around. So she was, definitely a presence hard to not notice. And yeah, with, such a strong personality, and yet you could tell there was her scars somehow came through. She did have a hard past, and that wasn't, I feel like you could see it in her eyes. But the thing I think that left me the strongest impression is that when I asked her, because you could see that she often had a sad expression on her face. And as I said, it comes spontaneous to attribute this to knowing all the challenges she had to face in her life, to attribute this to her personal story. And I do think to some extent it was. But when I asked her why she was often sad, she told me that it was due to all the hard things happening in the world. And in particular, because, as I said, Lesbos is very close to Turkey. So there was a lot of migrant people crossing through the sea, through this stretch of 8 kilometers of sea, and oftentimes landing on the very shores that, she experienced throughout her life. And so she could see this firsthand. And that was sort of the reason of her sadness was for the hardship of others. So in a way, sort of I don't know if she was particularly sensitive just, by nature, or her journey somehow made her even more sensitive to people's struggles. But you could tell that she was feeling people's pain as well.
Yeah, no, that's
that really
incredible.
stayed.
And what was your favorite moment when you photographed of her?
I think it's when, I don't know if you can picture the photo where she's looking at all the religious images in her bedroom. So yeah, she allowed me to go into her house, which was her family house, the house she grew up in, so where all her struggles began. And she was very devout, so she was buying a lot of, on one hand, she would buy this very flamboyant, as I said, dresses, very, I don't know, sorry, I missed the right vocabulary in English to describe them, but I feel like if you see the photo, you immediately understand.
Extravagant, probably, right? It's very out there.
Extravagant, yes, exactly, very out there, which is amazing. And at the same time, she was buying a lot of religious images, so she had completely filled the wall of votive images of saints, and she was really, really proud of this. So her eyes were lighting up when she was showing me this wall. And I'm not religious myself, but it's, I don't know, I find it fascinating because in a way maybe you would have the misconception that those two things don't go together, but in reality, we're all a sort of complex, not necessarily making sense mix of things, and so was she. And I think that's beautiful.
I think that's amazing, and I think, like you said, there's a lot of misconception, like just because you're a trans woman you can't be religious. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, it's because I feel like probably the church maybe has not always been the most
exactly
accepting, but yeah, she was she was both those things, and very proudly so.
And like you said, it's like capturing that moment just shows you the reality of humanity and like the lives that people do live. Like that's what I think I love about your work, is giving you a glimpse into everyday life for these people, rather than just pictures that you might see on the media when they're at their most desperate moments. But you've also worked in the Balkans, and as you mentioned, and then the Canary beaches in Kuala Lumpur. So what are the common threads that you see in people's experiences across those spaces? I don't know whether there are any similarities or whether they are completely different.
So yeah, this is a very, very interesting question. I think on one hand, it's an answer that it's the sort of, probably the opposite of the question, in the sense that the common threads are the diversity. Like the common thread is the diversity, sort of the diversity of humanity, of human characteristics. So, people would respond to challenging situations in all sorts of ways. You find anger, you find despair, and you find also a lot of hope, of course, which probably, in a way, it's probably skewed towards the hope and the resilience. And I feel that's in part a sort of self-selection. The people you meet are the people who feel more equipped to deal with the challenges ahead. In many cases, they're forced, of course, but maybe there's some light skew towards the hope side, but there's definitely also different type of reactions. And I'm talking both during the journeys and after the journeys themselves, in terms of, finding a job or, dealing with the reception system. And you can hear very different personalities coming through in how people respond to how challenging this can be, as it would be, everywhere in every situation. Humanity is varied and diverse. So on one hand, it's that. I want to say also that the common thread is the importance of human connection. And in this sense, I can think of both people connecting with others during the journey, like sharing part of the journeys with others, and how often you can see how that is a crucial ingredient in building that resilience, being able to share the hardship. It takes a lot of the burden away when you feel you're sharing that with others, isn't it? And I've seen that consistently. And also in terms of the importance of solidarity. So now I'm referring to the local communities and how the solidarity coming from the locals had an enormous impact, not just in practical terms, not necessarily, sorry, I'm saying the locals because that's something I focused on in particular, but obviously also from, the international community, wherever that solidarity is coming from, it doesn't matter, but it helped tremendously, not just in practical terms, because obviously the practical side is essential. If you can't fill your stomach or, have wood to burn to keep yourself warm, it's a very, very big part, but also the warmth of receiving that solidarity.
Completely. And I think, like you said, integration, I don't know if integration is the right word, but feeling like community like respects you or has an interest and wants to invite you into their space, I feel like is a massive aspect, which I feel like in a lot of places the tension causes it to be way worse. So it's interesting because
absolutely.
You mentioned that in the Bosnia one, didn't you? There was a lot of integration of how the local communities saw themselves because of what they experienced as well. I don't know if you want to share a bit about that.
Yeah. So in Bosnia, of course, people have still memories of the war, the war of Yugoslavia in the 90s. So they have lived experiences of, in many cases, displacement themselves or, armed conflict. So they're very often very hard experiences. And if they haven't had them themselves, it would be, it's very close, historically speaking. It's still very close. So if it wasn't themselves, it was their parents. So I was interested in how that would shape the response to the country facing a lot of, because something I didn't mention about the Balkan route, it's a very fluid route. So it goes through different countries in different it changes very, very often. The routes people take change very often due to, a probably unknown to most mix of reasons, including border control measures and smugglers networks and whatnot. And so Bosnia wasn't seeing a lot of migration for the first part of the Balkan route history, let's say, and it started at some point to see a massive increase. So obviously local communities it can be challenging for local communities. So what you said about like the response not being nice many times is definitely true. But I think we should also, pause before judging, because it can bring challenges for everyone. Especially, I've tried to speak with local people and hear their perspective. And you can see how often it's the issue is exacerbated by the border being closed, meaning people are strained more and more and trying to cross the border and not being able to cross their border, being pushed back and, ending up occupying abandoned buildings, ending up living on the street. That obviously brings challenges for everyone. And there's, maybe fear, sometimes, even just plain ignorance of what the situation is, but not in a sort of, when I say ignorance, I don't say it in a judgmental way, but in a sort of like it's just simply the literal meaning of the word, not knowing more about what the situation and who are these people and why are they coming here and what's happening and am I safe? Are my children safe? So obviously there's been all sorts of responses, including unfortunately negative ones, which is why the positive and solidarity ones are even more important to sort of counterbalance the impact of the negative ones. I didn't, even then, I guess my conclusion after talking with so many people is that the variety of responses is not any different to what you would expect in any other country that hasn't necessarily had the same recent history of conflict, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina. It felt that it was more intense. That's my personal takeaway. It felt that the negative responses were maybe more intense. The positive responses were more intense. Somehow there was a deeper feeling connected to the situation. I don't know if that makes sense. But
no, it does completely. And it's really interesting to hear, it from your side as well. Because obviously, like thinking about it, you can think about all the different connections and what it is like in the UK. But in different places, it might look different or it's different from what you hear from.
Yeah. For example, that's a lady you mentioned earlier, the one in the photo by the curtains. She fought during the war herself and then felt very she struggled for a while after with, I don't know if they call it survivor guilt, like with sort of wondering why she survived, because she lost obviously many people during the war. And she decided at some point, she turned to religion. She wasn't particularly religious before, and decided to devote her life to helping others. So in this way, what happened to her made her response of solidarity so much stronger. She's literally, giving herself to this cause. And the same is true for others. There's a man, Asim, who is also, I think, it was also part of those photos, who was detained in a concentration camp during the war. And he is, in an equally strong way, I want to say, devoting his life to helping people now traveling across his country and providing the support they're not getting.
It's incredible to hear, how, well, I mean, it's something that I would think of, but, when you go through something, what makes you want to do more for that cause, if that makes sense. Because like you said, survivor's guilt is such a massive thing, whether it's, refugees coming over or even migrants coming over and then working in the migrant field because they feel guilty that they can, live and work here and other people can't. I also had a question about, are there difference between women's experiences to men's experiences in your work specifically as well?
So what I've seen, I'm thinking now in particular of the Balkan route, but also the Canary Islands, where people come from West Africa through journeys on small boats, crossing a stretch of the Atlantic Sea. So it's a very hard and traumatic journey in a different way. On both of those routes, it feels like women face different challenges to men. In a way, they are offered better care because often they are automatically considered to be more vulnerable, which is more often the case, of course. Not necessarily always the case, but because obviously, when you have to deal with the situation, there needs to be sort of rules. So there will be, women have access to slightly better facilities, in some cases significantly better facilities. There won't be like a camp made of tents. It will be like a building with rooms and beds rather than a bunk bed in a tent outside. So women will have access to those facilities, and men only in specific limited set of circumstances. It depends. Obviously now I'm sort of, I don't want to generalize because every route is different, every place is different, but this is something I've encountered most of the time. And then in terms of the journey itself, it varies because women would sometimes travel alone, but often if there's a woman, it means that the whole family is traveling together. In that case, the whole family would have access to the better facility that I was referring to. And that means there are children. So obviously, I would say the level of vulnerability there is obviously, it's through the roof when it's a child, because of not just, because of how vulnerable a child is facing a journey like that, but for the sort of emotional burden of, the implication of going through this as a child rather than an adult with sort of, the tool to understand what's going on and deal with what's going on. So what I could see often is mothers' efforts to create as much as possible a little safe environment around their children, if that makes sense, a little bit of normality for their children. It would also be fathers doing the same for their children. It's not like it's really hard.
Dynamic.
Yes.
So just wondering, is there a different way that you portray genders in your work itself, or again, does it just vary on person to person? Because obviously each person is very unique and different in their own perspectives.
I feel I don't think there is a different way specifically. Yes, it's more like down to the person and what the person gives me, if that makes sense. I feel that being a woman in that respect means I am privileged in that I don't have, that's my experience, I don't have people assuming I'm a threat, which I can't be certain, but I would imagine for male photographers or journalists or people working in the field, it can sometimes, they are there with the best intention and they're equally harmless as me, but people would perceive them as a potential threat and therefore be more resistant to opening up or, allowing them into their space. I'm not saying this necessarily happens, but I think it can happen more to a man than it would to a woman. I don't know if also because I'm not very tall, I'm not very big, so maybe it's also that contributes to sort of, what harm could I possibly be doing? No, I'm joking now, of course, obviously, but it's in terms of how you're perceived, that could make a big difference. And I think being a woman certainly allowed me sort of a privileged access to an intimate space.
Funny, because we don't really think, like, whenever I think of being a woman, there's not many privileges that we do get. But in this line of work, it's really interesting to see that because of just the nature of what you might bring along. And I know we spoke a lot about ethics, kind of with consent and all that kind of stuff, but I was wondering whether there's any other ethical challenges that you face in your work as well and how you navigate them apart from just consent.
So there's something in particular that I happened to a photograph. It's a very specific thing. I don't know if it answers your question. And it's in a way connected with consent. When I was in the Canary Islands, I was documenting, as you said previously, mostly the situation after arrival. So the stories that go beyond the headlines, which are probably less interesting to a lot of people, but hopefully, as you said, more interesting for others. But at the same time, because the hardship of the journey in particular to get to the Canary Island from the west coast of Africa was a big part of how challenging this route is, because it's a journey that can last for days at sea and people often get lost, and there's very, very, very tragic stories of people, losing their way and just sometimes being rescued after weeks at sea with no water and no food, and sometimes unfortunately their remains being found. It's even happened that a few times they were found as far as the Caribbean. So the boat would just sort of drift with the currents for weeks and weeks or months even. And then, so a big part of how hard this route is the journey in itself. And obviously, the ones I met are the ones who had survived the journey. But it doesn't mean that in many cases, hopefully in the majority of the cases, they didn't have any major traumatic experience during the journey. But in many cases they had, with people having lost some of their friends or people on the same boat during the journey itself and being lost and, fearing for their lives for days before being rescued. And therefore it felt like the arrival was a big part and an important part. And I've tried to photograph the arrivals as well. So the arrival of the rescue operation, because obviously when it's the majority of people arrive on a rescue boat, even though maybe they weren't in particular distress, but obviously if a boat finds them, they would still rescue them. And those are the ones that you are able to see, because there's some time, there's a little, period of time that you're able to, you're alerted that it's happening and you can reach the port where they're going to come. But of course, the media aren't allowed next to where the people are being disembarked, because of course, these people have been through such a traumatic journey. They're being taken care of by the Red Cross, and on arrival, they're being, checked and made sure that they're safe and they don't need urgent medical attention. And so, of course, for very good reasons, you're not allowed very close to where this is happening. So the photographers who normally cover these stories for the news, they work with very long tele lenses to be able to still photograph what's happening. Whereas because normally I work with the people afterwards, and also for the type of work and photography that I prefer or feel sort of closer to, I tend to work with more wide angle lenses and being more sort of in the scene myself, close to the people, close to what's happening. So I do, I have a little tele, but I don't have particularly. So I wasn't able to capture very close images. One of the photographers there, when I was there, was very kind, and he lent me one of his lenses, a big tele lens. He said okay, well, he felt for me because I was there with my little short lens. He sort of offered to lend me his tele, and so I took a few shots with his tele. And one of this in particular, it's this man who, they were all sitting in this tent after the arrival. They were given water and checked, and they were just sitting there waiting, and he was looking at me, and he has this very intense gaze because he could see that I was taking a photo. And this is where the ethics comes in, because you won't have seen this photo, because I still feel very conflicted about it. And this was part of the story that then was published in Al Jazeera, and they did want the photo because originally I had submitted it with the original selection, but I felt so conflicted about it that I've ended up asking them to remove it. And to date, I'm still not sure what would be the right thing to do. And the reason is, on the one hand, he was in a very vulnerable moment and he couldn't possibly give me a real consent. I mean, not that in a way, you could argue any of the consents are real. How real is a consent? Like, as I mentioned earlier, someone withdrew it at some point. How many times do we need to check that consent is still there? It's not feasible. So, how real is any consent? Do you need to take into account the emotional state of the person? But it's an impossible puzzle to solve, I want to say, because also, some people just give you the consent. Some people are very happy if they want their story to be shared, but they might change their mind later on. It's a very complex thing. So in that case, I didn't feel comfortable sharing it because it felt like he couldn't, I sort of stole that photo with this telelens, also probably it's because I'm not used to using telelenses. I felt more uncomfortable using it. So it's maybe my limit of sort of not being used to that dynamic. So it felt wrong in a way. But then at the same time, the biggest thing for me that weighs on the opposite side is, I think, a limit of photography, which is at the same time probably power of photography, is the way we frame things. And something very interesting I've heard once that stayed with me is how images with a lot of people, images taken from afar with a lot of people in the image, showing the scene from afar, might give a feeling of an invasion, of like, a lot of people coming and invading our shores, invading our country, and a sort of, an emergency situation that we need to be scared of for some reason. Or they might sort of, obviously, it won't be the image itself, but it could sort of contribute and feed into a certain narrative. Whereas an image of an individual, where you can almost reflect yourself in his eyes, because he's looking straight into the lens.
It's more personal.
You can feel, it's a lot more personal. So in a way, that probably should have been the only image I shared about the arrivals.
It is a really difficult one, because I feel like
it's good that you take all of this in consideration, because I feel like some people just wouldn't and just be like, that's a photo and I'm going to share it. Whilst, you're really considering the person and seeing them as for who they are,
If you would change one misconception people have about migrants or migration, what would it be?
So for me, something really important that I feel it's a misconception is that there is a clear-cut distinction between who is a refugee and who is a migrant. And I feel like, of course, from a sort of legal perspective of the Refugee Convention, yes, you can reasonably well define who falls into that category. But I think that in real life, there's all sorts of reasons people choose or feel forced to some extent to leave their country. And it's, it's on a spectrum of, I don't know if you want to say like level of severity, but I wouldn't even put it in those terms. You can fit neatly into the definition of a refugee and be fearing for your life and feeling in immediate danger. But you can also be facing really, really, really strong hardships and not being able to feed your family or, make it in any dignified way, live a dignified life. So people have all sorts of possible reasons why they make such a hard decision. And it's often also a mix of reasons. So it's really hard to sort of fit people into neat categories. And I feel like it's important that we are aware of this. We refer to refugees on one hand being legal and migrants on the other hand being illegal, as if this was a very clear definition, whereas in reality, the sort of illegality, in inverted commas, comes from the journey being done in irregular ways because the border wouldn't be open to them. There's very, very few official pathways for people to seek asylum. So, it's not the fact that the journey is irregular doesn't mean anything in terms of the reasons the person is seeking protection.
I was just going to say, in terms of the Refugee Convention as well, under the Refugee Convention, anyone coming to any country isn't illegal. All routes are legal. This is why, I don't know, within the sector, I always have an issue with people using the word illegal routes, because technically there aren't any illegal routes because they're protected under the Refugee Convention. But it's interesting to think about terms of language and, what different words hold different meaning for different people. So like you said, migrant and refugee are very different in terms of how they're portrayed in media and in context. I remember you saying owning the word migrant again, or reclaiming the word migrant.
Yes, exactly. And that's where it comes from. In some cases, I've noticed there's almost a fear to use the word migrant, and, with the best intention of sort of avoiding the negative connotations that have become associated with the word migrant. There's a tendency to try and use different terms or just call people refugees to sort of stress that the majority of people are refugees. And whilst that comes, again, with the intention to highlight the need for supporting people coming, I think that it might backfire in the long term. I think we should instead, acknowledge that there is this spectrum, and that's okay. It's okay for someone to not be technically a refugee, and that doesn't necessarily make them not worthy of being welcome. The bottom line, I feel, is that the best way to fight misinformation and misconceptions is not to shy away from these complexities, because reality is very nuanced and sometimes even, contradictory or apparently contradictory in all these things we talked about, But yeah, I feel like the best way is to sort of embrace that complexity and try to bring that conversation rather than simplifying to avoid dealing, even if with the best intention, to avoid dealing with something that might be apparently controversial or complicated.
Just final question. So what's next for you? What project are you working on at the moment?
Something I'm really interested in that I hope will see the light one day, but it's just sort of in the initial phases, is about diaspora communities. So what happens after, basically, because obviously, there's all the challenges of the journey, but building a new life in a new country, as a person who's done that myself, it's challenging in itself, let alone if it comes with having had to leave your country and it not being by plain choice, or being worried for your family back home, not being able to visit your country, because that's unfortunately the reality for many. So I can't even begin to imagine, how much more challenging that is. And because I can see how even in the situation where I am, where I live in a foreign country, but it was by choice, I still find it challenging sometimes. I still sort of, miss home, but at the same time, where even is home,
I completely relate to you on that. No.
Yes.
The challenge of any migrant coming to the UK or anywhere is feeling that you've left what you have behind, but when you go back, it's not the same. And it's the same here. Well, yes, maybe I even sound British, but I don't feel it completely. So I think it's a really powerful thing. So I'm really excited to see. So yeah, thank you. It was such an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Łucja, for all the interesting questions.